For 40 long years, Clara had been the heartbeat of the city's music scene. If you lived in the town and knew anything about the violin, you knew Clara's name. She wasn't just a player. She was the kind of artist who could make a room go completely silent with just a single note. People traveled from neighboring towns just to hear her perform during the annual holidays. Her hands were famous, gifted with a magic touch that could make the strings sing like a human voice. But time can be cruel, even to the most talented among us. It started as a small stiffness in her fingers, an annoying little twitch that she tried to ignore. She thought it was just fatigue or maybe the cold weather. But as the months went by, the stiffness turned into pain. It wasn't the kind of pain that goes away with a hot bath or a day of rest. It was deep, sharp, and constant. When she went to the doctor, the news hit her harder than any bad review she had ever received. It was severe arthritis. The doctor looked at her x-rays and told her the harsh truth. Her days of playing the violin were numbered, and those numbers were running out fast. Clara tried to fight it. She was a fighter, after all. She tried to play scales in the morning, forcing her swollen joints to move, but the pain was blinding. The bow felt like it weighed a ton. The notes that used to flow out like water were now broken and shaky. One evening, in the middle of a practice session, she dropped the bow. It clattered onto the floor, and she just couldn't bring herself to pick it up. She sat there in her empty living room, staring at her hands, and cried. It felt like she was losing a part of her soul. The music that defined her life was being silenced, and there was nothing she could do about it. Word travels fast in a close-knit community. Soon, everyone knew about Clara's condition. The local symphony and the music school where she taught for decades decided they needed to do something. They wanted to show her that her legacy would live on, even if she couldn't play anymore. They organized a special event called a tribute to Clara. The idea was simple but emotional, a concert where her former students and colleagues would come together to play the pieces she loved the most. It was meant to be a celebration of her life's work, a way to say thank you before she retired completely. Clara was touched by the gesture. But deep down, it felt like a funeral service for her career. She accepted the invitation, of course. She couldn't let them down. But walking into the grand hall that night felt heavy. The air smelled of wax polish and expensive perfume. The stage was set up with rows of chairs and music stands. The chatter of the audience was loud and excited, but Clara felt like she was moving through a dream. She wore a long, elegant dress, but under the fabric. Her body was tense with pain. Her daughter Mira walked right beside her. Mira was 24 years old, a quiet young woman who usually worked in the background of her mother's life. While Clara was the star on the stage, Mira was the one who handled the logistics, the bookings, the sheet music, the rides home. She was practical and grounded, the complete opposite of her artistic mother. Mira had taken violin lessons when she was a little girl, but she quit by the time she was 12. Clara never pushed her, respecting that Mira didn't have the same passion for performing. As far as everyone knew, Mira hadn't touched a violin in over 10 years. They found their seats in the front row. Mira helped Clara sit down, adjusting a cushion behind her back to make her comfortable. "You look beautiful, Mom," Mira whispered, patting her mother's hand. Clara squeezed her daughter's hand, trying to smile. "I feel like an old relic being put on a shelf," she whispered back. Mira didn't say anything, just squeezed her hand tighter and looked straight ahead at the stage. The lights dimmed, and the chatter died down. The conductor walked out, and the orchestra began to play. The music was beautiful, truly. They played pieces from the Romantic era, full of swelling strings and dramatic crescendos. Clara recognized every note. She closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. She could visualize exactly where her fingers would be, how she would phrase the music. It was bittersweet. She was proud of her students. They were playing perfectly, but a pang of jealousy shot through her heart. She wanted to be up there. She wanted to be the one holding the bow. As the night went on, the program moved toward the end. The conductor came to the microphone for the final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice booming through the hall, "for our final piece tonight, we wanted to honor Clara in a special way. We are going to perform her signature arrangement of Ave Maria, but we cannot do this without her. Please welcome Clara to the podium to conduct us for this final song." The spotlight shot toward the front row. The audience erupted into applause. It was a warm, loving sound. People stood up, clapping and cheering. They wanted to see her one last time. Clara took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She looked at Mira. Mira nodded, her face serious, and helped her mother stand up. Clara walked slowly toward the stage steps. Her knees were shaking, but not from the arthritis this time. It was nerves. She felt exposed. The climb up the stairs felt like climbing a mountain. When she finally reached the podium, the conductor handed her the baton. It was light, made of fine wood, and polished to a shine. This was her tool, her weapon, her friend for so many years. She turned to face the orchestra. She saw dozens of eyes looking back at her eyes of her former students, her friends, her colleagues. They were waiting for her cue. The silence in the hall was absolute. Thousands of people were holding their breath. Clara raised her hands. She tried to steady them. She focused on the music in her mind. She was ready to give the downbeat to bring the sound in, but then disaster struck. Just as she lifted her hands high, a sharp, piercing spasm shot through her right wrist. It was like an electric shock. Her hand, the hand that had guided the bow for thousands of concerts, jerked violently. She tried to grip the baton tighter, but her fingers simply wouldn't listen. The baton slipped. She fumbled for it, knocking it against the metal stand of the podium. A dull thud echoed through the microphone system. The gasp from the audience was audible. It wasn't a gasp of judgment, but of collective sympathy, and that was almost worse. Clara froze. She tried to recover, tried to lift her hand again, but the tremors took over. Her whole arm began to shake uncontrollably. She looked at the musicians. The first violinist looked ready to play, unsure of what to do. Tears of frustration and humiliation welled up in Clara's eyes. She couldn't do it. Her body was betraying her in the cruelest way possible, right in front of everyone she loved. She felt the heat rising in her cheeks. She felt small. The pain in her wrist was nothing compared to the crushing weight of her pride shattering. She lowered her head. She couldn't conduct. She couldn't even hold herself together. The silence stretched on, agonizingly long. It felt like hours, though it was only seconds. Clara let her hands drop to her sides. She shook her head slightly at the conductor. She couldn't speak. She just turned and began to walk away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She felt like a fraud who had been caught pretending to be a musician. The tribute, which was supposed to be a victory lap, had turned into a public display of her decline. She reached the edge of the stage, ready to disappear into the wings and hide forever. But just as she stepped down, she saw a movement out of the corner of her eye. Someone was coming up the stairs from the side of the stage. It wasn't a stagehand or an official. It was a young woman in simple clothes, moving with a strange, determined urgency. Clara stopped and looked back. It was Mira. Clara stood frozen on the edge of the stage, her hand hovering over the railing that would lead her down into the safety of the wings. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The humiliation of the past few minutes felt like a heavy stone sitting in her chest. She just wanted to disappear. She wanted to go home, take off her dress, and sit in her armchair where no one could see her hands shake. But as she turned her body to leave, something blocked her path. It was Mira. Clara blinked, confused for a moment. She thought Mira was coming to help her down the stairs, to guide her away from the staring eyes and the awkward silence. "Mira," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's go. Please take me home." But Mira didn't move to help her mother down. Instead, she stepped up, placing her feet firmly on the stage platform. She was wearing a simple beige cardigan and dark trousers clothes that looked completely out of place under the bright white theatrical lights. She didn't look like a performer. She looked like someone who had come to fix a microphone or move a music stand, yet there was something in her eyes that stopped Clara from speaking another word. Mira's face was pale, but her expression was set. It was a look of pure, steel-eyed determination that Clara had never seen in her daughter before. "Mom, wait," Mira said softly. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Mira gently took Clara by the shoulders and turned her around. She guided her mother back toward the front of the stage, away from the exit. Then, without a word of explanation, Mira walked past her. She walked toward the center of the stage where the conductor, a tall man named Mr. Henderson, was standing looking bewildered. He was holding his baton loosely, glancing from the musicians to the audience, clearly unsure of how to save the moment. The concert was falling apart, and he knew it. The audience was restless now. The polite silence had turned into a low murmur of voices. People were shifting in their seats, coughing and whispering to one another. Everyone could see the young woman in the cardigan walking toward the conductor. Hundreds of pairs of eyes locked onto her. Confusion swept through the hall like a wave. Who was this? What was happening? Was she a stagehand? Was there a technical issue? Mr. Henderson watched Mira approach, his eyebrows furrowed. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to tell her that this wasn't the time for whatever she needed. But Mira didn't stop at the podium to talk to him. She walked right past him, ignoring him completely. She moved down the line of musicians until she reached the concertmaster, the lead violinist, who sat at the front of the section. The concertmaster, an older woman who had known Clara for decades, looked up in shock as Mira stopped in front of her. The murmuring in the audience grew louder. People were leaning forward, trying to understand what was going on. Clara stood near the edge of the stage, her breath caught in her throat. She watched, paralyzed, as Mira extended her hand toward the concertmaster. At first, the older woman didn't move. She just stared at Mira's hand, then up at her face. It looked like a standoff. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. The orchestra members stopped tuning their instruments. The cellists put down their bows. Everyone was waiting slowly. The realization seemed to dawn on the concertmaster. Looked from Mira to Clara, who was standing helplessly in the wings, and then back to Mira. A slow look of understanding crossed the older woman's face. It was a look of shock mixed with a strange kind of hope. Without saying a word, the concertmaster stood up. She held her precious violin, one of the finest instruments in the orchestra, out toward Mira. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. This was unheard of. He didn't just walk on stage and take the concertmaster's violin. It broke every rule of protocol. But Mira didn't hesitate. She reached out and took the instrument. She treated it with reverence, her hands moving instinctively. To check the tuning pegs and the tension of the bow, she didn't walk to the conductor's podium. Instead, she pulled a single music stand out from the row and positioned it right at the very center of the stage. Facing the audience, she stood there, alone. The orchestra sat behind her, silent and confused. The conductor stood to the side, watching with his arms crossed, his face a mask of curiosity. Clara felt her knees go weak.
Ow.
She leaned against the heavy velvet curtain for support. What is she doing? She thought frantically. Mira hasn't played seriously in years. She's going to embarrass herself. She's going to make it worse. From the audience, the view was surreal. Here was this young woman, dressed like she was ready for a walk in the park, standing on one of the most prestigious stages in the country, holding a violin worth more than most people's cars. It felt like a practical joke, or perhaps a brave but foolish attempt to save her mother's dignity. Mira closed her eyes for a long moment. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the dusty air of the theater. She could feel the heat of the spotlight on her face. She could feel the thousands of eyes burning into her. A year ago, she would have fainted from the pressure. But tonight, she wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about the woman standing in the shadows. She was thinking about the late nights she had heard her mother crying in the kitchen because her hands hurt too much to hold a cup of tea. She was thinking about the legacy that was about to be buried under silence. Mira opened her eyes.
Ow.
She lifted the violin and tucked it firmly under her chin. She raised the bow. The movement was not tentative. It was sharp, confident, and precise. The orchestra members began to whisper among themselves. They recognized the posture. They recognized the way Mira held the bow at just the right angle. Her wrist relaxed yet firm. It was an eerie mirror of how Clara used to stand, the lead. Cellist, a man who had played with Clara for 20 years, narrowed his eyes. He leaned forward, watching Mira's fingers. The conductor, Mr. Henderson, was the first to understand. He saw the focus in Mira's eyes. He realized she wasn't there to apologize or to make a speech. She was there to play. He looked at the score on his podium. It was Ave Maria. He knew the piece by heart. He looked back at Mira and saw that she didn't even have the sheet music. She wasn't looking at the stand. She was staring straight ahead, into the darkness beyond the stage lights. Slowly, gracefully, Mr. Henderson raised his hands. He didn't say a word to the orchestra. He didn't need to. Simply gave a sharp, subtle gesture with his right hand. The orchestra reacted instantly. The soft hum of the strings began, a low, mournful carpet of sound that washed over the audience. But they didn't start the melody. They were playing the introduction, the accompaniment. They were waiting for her. For 10 seconds, the music swelled, beautiful and tragic, filling the massive hall. Mira stood perfectly still, her bow hovering just above the strings. She was waiting for the exact right moment. The beat where the soul of the song entered, the audience had gone completely quiet again. The confusion had vanished, replaced by a palpable sense of anticipation. Even the people who didn't know music could feel that something significant was about to happen. Clara watched from the wings, tears streaming down her face now, though she didn't know why. A strange feeling was rising in her chest, a feeling of fear, yes, but also a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Mira closed her eyes again. She let the memory of her mother's playing guide her. She visualized the sound she wanted to make. She wasn't Mira the accountant anymore. She wasn't the quiet daughter. She was the vessel. And then, with a smooth, fluid motion, she drew the bow across the strings. The first note pierced the air, pure and clear, slicing through the heavy silence like a beam of light. The sound that filled the hall didn't just float. It seemed to pierce through the very air, reaching the back rows of the balcony with a clarity that felt almost supernatural. The first note of Ave Maria was not tentative or shaky. It was firm, warm, and rich, exactly the way a violin should sound, but with a depth that is usually only heard from players with decades of experience. The low, vibrating hum grabbed the attention of every single person in the room instantly. The murmuring stopped. The shuffling of feet ceased. Even the air conditioning seemed to hum in harmony. For the first few seconds, nobody could breathe. They just stared at the young woman in the beige cardigan who was producing this sound from an instrument. She wasn't even supposed to know how to play. Mira's eyes were still closed, but her hands were moving with a mind of their own. Her left fingers danced along the neck of the violin, pressing down on the strings with precise pressure, creating notes that were perfectly in tune. Her right hand holding the bow moved in long, smooth strokes. To anyone watching, it looked effortless, as if the bow were an extension of her arm. But up close, if you looked at her face, you could see the intense concentration. Her jaw was set tight, and a small bead of sweat began to form on her forehead. She wasn't just playing a song. She was pouring every ounce of her being into the instrument, in the wings. Clara felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her. She leaned heavily against the thick velvet curtain, her hand covering her mouth. The sound coming from the stage was achingly familiar. It wasn't just that the song was Ave Maria. It was how Mira was playing it. The phrasing, the way she lingered just a fraction of a second longer on the high notes before sliding back down was exactly how Clara used to play it. It was like watching a ghost, or perhaps a mirror image of herself from 30 years ago. Tears blurred Clara's vision, but she couldn't wipe them away. She was too afraid to look away for even a split second. On stage, the conductor, Mr. Henderson, was a professional who had seen thousands of performances in his career. He was rarely surprised. But as he stood at his podium watching Mira, he felt a chill run down his spine. He realized immediately that this was not a stunt. This young woman knew exactly what she was doing. He glanced at the sheet music on his stand, then back at Mira. She wasn't looking at the music. She didn't need it. He made a split-second decision. He softened his conducting, making his motion smaller, signaling the orchestra to back off slightly. He turned the group into a gentle ocean of sound, letting Mira be the ship sailing on top of it. He was no longer leading. He was supporting her. The orchestra, confused at first, quickly caught on. The musicians were talented. They could feel the pulse of the music changing. The cellists, dug their bows in a little deeper, providing a soulful foundation. The harpist plucked the strings with delicacy, creating a raindrop effect behind the melody. They stopped looking at the conductor and started looking at Mira. They were playing for her now, matching their volume and emotion to hers. There was a shared feeling of magic among them. They knew they were witnessing something special, something that had never happened before, and would likely never happen again in that hall. As the song moved from the introduction into the main melody, the audience began to realize the magnitude of the moment. This wasn't just a daughter playing a song for her mother. This was a masterclass. People in the front row leaned forward, their eyes wide. A music critic who had come to review the gala, sitting in the third row with a notepad on his lap, stopped writing. He put his pen down completely. He knew that adjectives in a newspaper wouldn't be able to capture this. He just sat there, captivated, letting the music wash over him. But the most stunned people in the room were the ones who knew Clara best. Her former students sitting in the orchestra or watching from the audience exchanged glances of disbelief. They remembered Mira as the shy girl in the hallway who always carried her mother's bag. They never thought she had this kind of talent hidden inside her. How was this possible? When did she practice? How did she learn this incredibly difficult arrangement, one that Clara had spent years perfecting? The answer lay in the history of their home life, a secret that Clara was only now beginning to piece together as she listened. For years, Mira had been the quiet observer. She had sat in the corner of the living room hundreds of times while Clara taught lessons. She had heard the corrections, the advice on bowing, the discussions about vibrato. She had absorbed it all like a sponge. But more than that, Mira had spent the last year watching her mother deteriorate. She had seen the frustration in Clara's eyes when the fingers wouldn't work. She had felt the sadness in their house as the music faded away. Unbeknownst to Clara, Mira had been sneaking into the music room at night. After Clara went to bed, Mira would go into the study, take down Clara's old practice violina, cheaper instrument Clara kept for beginners, and close the door. She would play softly, the sound muffled by the heavy oak door and the thick carpet. She played until her fingers hurt, trying to replicate the sounds she had grown up hearing. She wasn't doing it to become famous. She was doing it to understand her mother. She was doing it to keep the music alive in the house, even if Clara couldn't do it herself. She had spent hundreds of nights in that dark room, teaching herself to play with her heart, not just her hands. Now, that secret dedication was exploding into the light. The song began to climb higher, the notes becoming more difficult, requiring Mira to move her hand rapidly up and down the neck of the violin. This was the part where many players would struggle, where the sound could become thin or screeching. But Mira's fingers flew across the strings with blur-like speed. Her bowing arm was steady, driving the rhythm forward. The sound was soaring, lifting up toward the high ceiling of the concert hall. The audience was no longer just watching. They were feeling it. The music was sad, yes, because of the melody, but it was also full of love. It felt like a conversation between a daughter and her mother. Every phrase seemed to say, "I see you. I hear you. I am you." People in the audience who didn't know Clara personally found themselves tearing up. It was the raw emotion of the performance that got to them. It wasn't technically perfect in a robotic, studio recording way. There were small imperfections, a breathiness here and there, but those imperfections made it human. They made it real. Clara was shaking violently now. She wanted to run onto the stage and hug Mira, but she was rooted to the spot. She felt a strange mix of emotions, pride so intense it hurt her chest, confusion about how she had missed this talent in her own daughter, and a profound sense of release. For so long, she had been holding onto her music with a tight grip, terrified of letting go because she didn't know who she was without it. Seeing Mira up there, playing her song with such passion, Clara realized she didn't have to let it go. It was already safe. It was inside Mira. As the music swelled toward the climax, the lights of the hall seemed to dim on their own. Or perhaps it was just the focus of the crowd narrowing down to that one spot. Mira's face was glistening with sweat. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm, totally lost in the music. She wasn't thinking about the crowd anymore. She wasn't thinking about the conductor. She was thinking about the nights she sat by her mother's bedside, listening to her cry in pain. She was thinking about the promise she had whispered to herself in the dark room. If she can't play anymore, I will play for her. The orchestra reached a crescendo. A wall of sound that rose up behind Mira, supporting her like a wave lifting a surfer. And Mira, riding that wave, hit the highest note of the piece. She held it. The note was pure, sharp, and cuttingly clear. She didn't vibrato it at first. She held it straight and steady, letting the silence within the note vibrate. Then, slowly, she added the tremble, the vibrato that gave the note voice. It sounded like a cry of the heart. The sound hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. The conductor held his arms up, keeping the orchestra sustaining the chord underneath. The audience was frozen. It was the peak of the emotional journey. Mira stood there, her eyes still closed, her body one with the violin. She was giving everything she had, leaving nothing on the table. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered humanity. It wasn't about skill anymore. It was about spirit. And then, as if the energy in the room had reached its maximum capacity, the song began its slow descent. The melody started to soften, the notes drifting downward, signaling the end was near. The tension in the hall shifted from a peak to a gentle release. Mira's bowing slowed down. The volume dropped until it was just a whisper. The orchestra faded into the background, becoming a soft hum, leaving Mira's violin to carry the final, lonely notes of the melody. She played the last phrase with a tenderness that was heartbreaking. She let the final note fade away, pulling the bow slowly off the string until there was nothing left but silence. Mira lowered her violin. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. It was a heavy, sacred silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The audience sat in the dark, stunned by what they had just experienced. Mira stood there, her chest heaving, her arms trembling with exhaustion, opening her eyes slowly. She didn't look at the crowd. She turned her. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, the heavy silence in the concert hall remained unbroken. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air has turned into water. The final note of the song had faded away, but the feeling of it hung in the air, vibrating against the walls. Hundreds of people sat in the darkness, stunned. They were processing what they had just heard. It wasn't just a performance. It was an emotional experience that had touched something deep inside them. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the musicians on stage, usually the first to shuffle their sheet music or adjust their chairs, sat frozen, their eyes fixed on the young woman in the beige cardigan. Then a sound broke the spell. It was the sharp, slow clap of an older man sitting in the front row. He didn't stand up, but he looked at the stage with tears in his eyes and brought his hands together with purpose. Within a heartbeat, someone else joined in. Then a third person. Suddenly, like a wave crashing against a shore, the entire hall erupted. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar of raw emotion. People leaped to their feet as one. The sound was deafening, a wall of noise that bounced off the high ceiling. Hundreds of hands were coming together, shouts of bravo. An encore? Mixed with the applause, it was the kind of reaction usually reserved for the world's greatest soloists, not a shy accountant no one had ever heard of. Mira stood center stage, bathed in the blinding white spotlight. Her chest was heaving, her body exhausted from the physical and emotional effort of the performance. She lowered the violin slowly, her hands trembling slightly. The adrenaline that had fueled her was starting to fade, leaving her feeling lightheaded. She blinked against the bright lights, trying to see past them into the dark auditorium. The wall of sound coming from the audience was overwhelming. It washed over her, warm and loud, but she didn't feel like a star. She felt exposed. Her face flushed a deep red, and she instinctively wanted to shrink away, to hide behind the music stand. Normally, at this point in a concert, the soloist would turn to the audience and take a bow. They would smile and acknowledge the conductor and the orchestra. But Mira didn't do any of that. She stood there for a moment, looking down at the violin in her hands. It was the concertmaster's instrument, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship made of dark, aged wood. She treated it with a gentle reverence, carefully loosening the bow with her fingers. A habit her mother had drilled into her years ago: always respect the instrument. Then, she did something unexpected. Instead of turning to the crowd, Mira turned her back on them. She walked toward the side of the stage, toward the heavy velvet curtains that led to the wings. The applause didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder as people realized she was moving. They thought she was going to take her bow near the edge, but she wasn't looking at the audience. Her eyes were fixed on a single spot in the shadows. Just off stage, Clara was standing there, clutching the curtain so hard her knuckles were white. She was shaking, but not from the cold this time. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her makeup, but she didn't care. She was looking at her daughter, seeing a stranger, and yet the person she loved most in the world, all at the same time. She felt a swell of pride so intense it made her chest ache. This was her daughter, her blood, her legacy. The music hadn't died with Clara's hands. It had just been waiting for a new vessel. Mira stopped right at the edge of the stage, the very line where the bright light met the dark shadow. She didn't say anything into the microphone. There wasn't one nearby. She didn't need to speak. She simply extended her hand toward the darkness. It was a gesture of invitation, palm open. She was asking her mother to come out. Clara shook her head frantically. "No," she whispered to herself, stepping back further into the shadows. "No, Mira, this is your moment. Don't let them see me like this." She was terrified. She was afraid that if she stepped into the light, people would see the old, broken woman who couldn't even hold a baton. She didn't want to ruin the perfect image of Mira's triumph. Mira didn't withdraw her hand. She stood there, persistent. She looked at Clara with an intensity that cut through the darkness. The orchestra members watched, curious. The conductor, standing near his podium, realized what was happening. He gently signaled the musicians to stop playing the introductory notes they had started for an encore. The room quieted down slightly as the audience sensed a shift in the atmosphere. They watched the silent interaction at the side of the stage with bated breath. Mira took a small step forward. Right to the lip of the stage, she mouthed a single word to her mother: "Please." The simplicity of that word broke through Clara's fear. She looked at Mira's face, flushed, sweaty, but filled with such unconditional love. Clara realized that Mira hadn't done this just to show off. She had done this for Clara, and if Clara refused to come out, she was refusing that gift. She took a shaky breath, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and let go of the curtain. Her legs felt weak, like jelly, but she forced them to move. She took one step, then another, walking from the safety of the wings into the blinding spotlight. As soon as the audience saw Clara, a new wave of emotion swept through the room. The applause changed tone. It became softer, warmer, almost protective. They saw the older woman, struggling to walk steadily, supporting herself with one hand on the air. They saw the daughter waiting for her. It was a scene that transcended music. It was a scene of family, of love, of the passing of a torch. Clara reached the center of the stage where Mira stood. She felt dizzy under the heat of the lights, but Mira's hand was there, steady and strong, gripping her arm. Mira didn't bow to the crowd. Instead, she turned to face her mother directly. She lifted the violin, the instrument that had caused Clara so much pain and so much joy, and held it out between them. For a moment, Clara just looked at it. She saw the strings, the fingerboard, the scroll. It was an object that defined her entire life. She slowly reached out her hands. They were shaking, the gnarled knuckles swollen and red. She gently touched the wood of the violin. She didn't try to take it. She didn't try to play it. She just rested her hands on it, closing her eyes. It was a moment of acceptance. She was accepting that she couldn't be the player anymore, but she was the source. The music had come from her, and now it lived in this instrument, and in her daughter. Mira saw the struggle in her mother's hands. She saw the pain, but she also saw the peace. Slowly, she pulled the violin back toward her own chest, but she kept one hand covering Clara's hands. It was a bridge between them. The crowd watched in absolute silence. Not a single person spoke. They were witnessing a private moment of healing happening in public. Then, Mira did something that made the conductor, a tough veteran of the music world, wipe his eyes. She guided Clara to turn around. Mira stood slightly behind her mother, her arm wrapped around Clara's waist, holding her close. Mira rested her chin on her mother's shoulder. Together, they faced the audience. Clara straightened her back as much as she could. She looked out at the sea of people. She wasn't the broken woman she felt like a few minutes ago. She was the mother of a miracle. A tearful, brilliant smile broke across her face. She squeezed Mira's arm that was wrapped around her waist. It was a picture that told a story without words. The young woman holding the violin, capable of creating beauty. The older woman standing strong despite her pain, the creator of that beauty. They were two halves of a whole. The audience exploded again. It was the loudest cheer of the night. People were standing on their seats. An older woman in the second row was sobbing openly, clutching her husband's arm. A young music student in the balcony was clapping so hard his hands stung, his eyes wide with inspiration. They weren't just cheering for the performance of Ave Maria. They were cheering for the resilience of the human spirit. They were cheering for the idea that even when we lose something precious, it isn't truly gone if we have passed it on to someone we love. Mira didn't take a bow by herself. She bowed her head slightly while holding her mother, forcing Clara to take a bow with her. It was a shared honor. And as the thunderous applause rained down on them, Clara felt a sense of gratitude that washed away all the bitterness of her illness. She realized then that her hands weren't broken. They had just done their most important work. They had taught Mira, and now Mira was playing for her.